Good evening, everyone. I'm Veronica Roberts. I'm curator of modern and contemporary art, and I am joined by my fabulous colleague, Claire Howard, assistant curator of modern and contemporary art, and you get a prize if you recognize her backdrop. Thank you for joining us for the third Curated Conversations, which is filling gaps and finding gems. We're going to talk about some of our favorite recent acquisitions to the Blanton's collection and share a little behind the scenes also about sort of how we found the artists and why we chose the work. And we're happy to answer. This is a tell-all, so ask all your burning questions about acquisitions. And Carter, you can't win the prize for recognizing Claire's backdrop since you are a colleague of ours, but, but I like that people are already chiming in with their guesses. So this is our third curated conversation, and I just wanted to thank you all for being here. We know that some of you are on West Coast time zones. It's still happy hour wherever you are, so feel free to join us with a drink. And we're thrilled to have a couple of the artists actually that we're talking about are also on here. So if we can't answer any of your questions, we might actually just ask them through the Q&A. Just one word about how you ask questions. If you don't mind, put your Q&A whenever you have a question. It doesn't need to be at the end. You can just, there's a little button at the bottom that says Q&A, and put your questions there, and we'll keep an eye on that. It's better than the chat function. We can't hear you or see you because we're going to be showing some images. We're the only ones who are visible on the screen. And also we do this every Tuesday at 5 Central Standard Time, and we have different fun topics, so you're welcome to join us anytime. Just register in advance. And I also want to just give a little shout out to our virtual AV team, because just like doing a program at the museum, there's sort of a team of people behind the scenes. So thank you so much, Stacy Hoyt and Carlotta and Lynn Mayfies, for helping pull tonight's talk together. So I'm going to get going and start, and then I'll pass the baton off to Claire. But I wanted to just give you a tiny bit of Blanton trivia before I talk about Nate Lewis's work, one of the artists that I'm featuring. And one of the things that I was really excited about when I joined the Blanton 7 years ago, I love to build collections. I love thinking about how to make our collection greater and better. And it's really one of the biggest joys of being a curator and working at the Blanton. But one of the things I was really struck by when I arrived at the Blanton was that so much of our collection comes from a kind of unexpected place. And the core of the modern and contemporary art collection actually comes from a novelist, which you don't really think of novelists being the start of great art collections. But if any of you are familiar with James Michener and his wife, Mari Michener, they gave us a substantial body of work. And so when the museum reopens, take a look at those labels, and you'll see that a lot of them say gift of James and Mari Michener. And Michener wasn't from Austin, but he taught English at UT, and there's a Michener Center for Writing at UT that he also helped create. And he felt like Austin deserved a world-class art collection, and there wasn't one at the time. We're the only collecting art museum in town, really. And so he helped make that happen. And his wife was really avid collector as well. So kind of a beautiful story. Oh, we have a winner. Ruth Fahili, you have guessed the backdrop of Claire Howard's Zoom, which is Garden of Earthly Delights. So I will figure out what your prize is and find out where you live later. I should also tell you all that I'm wearing a skirt for the first time in 5 weeks. So that's another really exciting thing that's happening tonight. All right, let's get started. If you don't mind queuing up the PowerPoint, we'll get started with Nate Lewis. There he is. So this is Nate Lewis. He is an artist that I have been excited about and following for, I think it's about 2 years. And how I came across his work, and we can cue to the next slide. This is the work that just recently entered our collection. And I'll tell you about how I came across his work, because it's a wonderful kind of backstory. But this is an amazing photo-based collage drawing. It's called Signaling 16, and it's about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide. And what I was really struck by was Nate's path to being an artist. he didn't actually study to be an artist. He has a nursing degree, and he talks about how he actually never really made art growing up, and he didn't really start drawing for the first time seriously in his life until he was about 25 years old. So, and he was a couple of years into being a nurse. So his background is that he said, I remember him telling me at one point that he knew he wanted to be a nurse when he was in the 6th grade. And most of us, when we think about what we want to be in the 6th grade, that's not what we end up doing. But in his case, he became a nurse. He was a nurse for about 9 years in ICU units. He worked in, let's see, he started in the medical surgical IC unit, and then he worked in a stroke unit for a year, and then worked in a neuroscience surgical intensive care unit for 4 years, and also spent some time in critical care recovery. So not your typical artist path. And his dad was a nurse, so he was following in his father's footsteps. And sorry, someone says the image is a little cropped, and so I don't know if that can be adjusted. I'm seeing it fine on my screen, but hopefully you guys are all seeing a beautiful image of a man with his arm draped over his face, and his face is tilted, and he's not wearing a shirt. And what you'll notice is the incredible, oh, it says you cannot see it at all. Okay, I need some little AV help. Sorry, you guys are trying to imagine this. Stacy's working on it. All right, I won't talk about details just yet then. Let me just share then a little bit of the backstory as we're pulling up the image. Okay, and okay, can anyone else? Thank you guys, this is awesome. Okay, a bunch of people are saying they're seeing it perfectly. Does anyone still not see it? This was not supposed to be like holographic presentation. Okay, all right, so far it sounds good. So what you're seeing is in this work, Signaling 16 from 2019, this is a series he started making. When he began drawing, he worked with sort of electrocardiogram strips in the hospital. And I get the impression his sister actually was part of the impetus for him working as an artist. She's an artist and encouraged him. And he began working with medical supplies essentially, and discovered that he really enjoyed the process and became more committed. And what I love about the way he makes his work is that he's cutting into the paper. So he's starting with a photograph, he works with a model, and you can see, I think this model is a trained dancer. There's a real elegance to the figure and the gesture. I think if I tried to hold this pose, it would not be quite so elegant. And then what he's doing is he's working with photography, and then he's making some digital manipulations, deciding certain areas that he'll make white or black, and then he's cutting into the paper using a blade. And he talks about, thinking of the piece of paper like it's an organism, and having and has an understanding that there's so much that you can get from the surface of the paper. And he talks about exploring the paper. I'm just going to read one thing he said to me that I thought was so beautiful. He said, "Exploring the paper, how I do, is an act of care, exploration, and understanding." And he said, working as an ICU nurse is the most intense care he's had to give on a regular basis. It's shaped my lens to see the world, but for me, it's also the most thorough, intentional way to care and understand for something. And so what you're seeing is that he's picking away at the paper. So it's almost like a picotage with a blade on the face. So that sort of dotted, mottled surface of the face is actually cutting away at the paper. And then if you scroll ahead to some details, if you can advance the images. This is a close-up where you can see, and so you see he's picking the paper with a blade in one direction with the sort of the brighter parts, and then on the arm, he's sometimes going in 2 different directions, and so it creates this really beautiful, just going in 2 different directions, and it creates this kind of beautiful surface. And then the next detail. And there's a beautiful passage with ink in there. And then the next detail. And this is probably one of my favorite details. I know it's a little blown up, but one of the things that when I saw this with the collectors who were kind enough to acquire this for the Blanton, my friends Brent and Stephen, when we saw this work together in Miami, this was the one that really spoke to us. And we all agreed it was just incredible. And part of what made it so incredible was the different ranges of techniques that are in the single work. So what you're looking at here is frottage. And if you're not an art history geek like us and you don't know that term, you still have done it before. Basically, anytime you've put like a leaf underneath a piece of paper as a kid and then used a Crayola and drawn over the piece of paper, and then the texture of the leaf comes through, that's frottage. And it's a technique that the Surrealists and people like Max Ernst used a lot. And what Nate did here is he had painted the arm white, and then he put lace underneath the paper and then used a graphite stick over the top. And so the lace is coming through and it's being registered in graphite on top of paint. Just exquisite. And his interest in all of thinking about the body as a landscape, I was really struck by that, and also struck by the way he's always interrupting the human form and interrupting the imagery. And he talks about that he's sort of over the years realizing why he's so interested in interrupting the image of the body. And he says it's about altering imagery for him is about the unseen, because in taking care of people and being in ICU rooms when people are so vulnerable and dealing with life and death situations, it's the unseen, the diagnostic lenses that doctors and nurses are using to understand what the issues are. And so he's, I think, interested, whether it's diagnostic lenses or microscopes or blood tests. So I think he's realizing that this is, he's realized that this is a way that he understands the world and his process of making work. So that's the amazing Nate Lewis. We have one more image that is another, this is some of the tools, which this is a photo I took in his studio in the Bronx. So here are some of the tools he uses to cut the paper. The blade. And then the next image is another amazing work that was given to us. So we now have two promised gifts, and this is from a more recent body of work called Probing the Land, where he's looking at Confederate statues in sculptures in Richmond, Virginia. And just a little background on how and why Nate and how he came into the collection, because there's always a story behind every work of art. And even though art fairs are not my favorite way to spend time with artists' work, they are incredibly helpful for discovering new artists. And so I first saw Nate's work. He was showing with Ilya Friedman, his gallerist, and had a solo presentation at the Armory 2 years ago. And a curator from Crystal Bridges, Lauren Haynes, told me, "Oh, you've got to see this work, Veronica, you'd really love it." And I went and saw the work and was really amazed by it. I told Ilya I was amazed by it. I did not hide my hand. I told him, and he knew that we were interested. And then he had another solo presentation, because I think everything had sold out within like a day in that presentation. And then in Miami, he had another presentation with Nate. And I told collectors in Austin that they should check out the work, and they fell in love with it too. And we were lucky enough to see it on the first day of the fair, and they purchased it for the Blanton as a promise gift. So, and that's what happened. And so it was really kind of a wonderful story. And that's how works enter the collection, lots of different ways, but that's one of them. So I am going to turn it over to Claire, unless there are any questions about this work, and you can totally ask questions at the end too, so. Oh wait, I see one Q&A, sorry. Let me just see if this was a question. Okay, anonymous attendee, I like this. Even though you're invisible, you still wanted to be anonymous, no problem. It says, how often do people send you tips on emerging artists, and how does the process of arranging a studio visit go? Do you always visit before buying? Okay, those are great questions. How often do people send me tips on emerging artists? Every day. And especially other curators give me tips all the time. And Claire will say, oh, I've seen something, you should see it. We're exchanging sort of interest that we have. And I would say there's very little impulse shopping. We don't like look at something and decide to buy it on the spot. We're spending time getting to know the artist practice. And in this case, yes, I did do a studio visit before we acquired a work, but I wouldn't say that we always do. That's not always possible. You might fall in love with an artist's work and they live in South Africa and you can't fly to South Africa before making a decision. But yes, studio visits are essential. And how does the process of arranging a studio visit go? That is usually just, in this case, me saying, Ilya, I love Nate's work. How do I visit a studio? And then Ilya put me in touch. But yeah, he also has a website and I could have reached out to him directly, but I always like to go through the gallery. So, and then Mark, we'll save your question for after Claire's presentation since it's just as relevant to that. So yeah, without further ado, Claire Howard.
Okay. Thank you, Veronica. Stacy, if we could start the slides. Thank you. I'm going to be talking first about an untitled work on paper by the American Surrealist artist Dorothea Tanning that we were really thrilled to have enter the collection earlier this year. It's crayon and watercolor on paper. It was made in 1965. And it's an early work from Tanning's series of what she called friezes. They're kind of made in mixed media. What defines them is they were kind of made in a horizontal format. And you can see in the dimensions, this one's about 4.5 or 4.25 inches tall by almost 2.5 feet wide. So long and skinny. These are usually scraps of paper cut from larger sheets. And Tanning made a number of these between the 60s and 70s. So this one is from 1965, pretty early in the series. And Tanning wrote about this series in her 1992 book, Hail Delirium. She said, in 1965, a series of friezes began for me. Between sessions devoted to painting on big canvases, I drew, generally with soft lead and very fast, my figures on long strips of elegant papers. A simple exercise at first, it became over the years a continuing need. So I love this idea of kind of working through different forms, using this as kind of a method of experimentation. And we were really thrilled to have it enter the collection as a gift from our friend Douglas Cushing in honor of the former Blanton curator, Francesca Consagra. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'll tell you a little bit about Dorothea Tanning. She was born in 1910 in Galesburg, Illinois. She moved to New York in 1935, and in 1936, she had this kind of turning point in her life when she saw the MoMA exhibition, fantastic art, Dada, Surrealism. And on the left, you see her self-portrait Birthday. This is one of her best-known works. It's in Philadelphia. And she painted it in 1942, which was the year that she met the Surrealist artist Max Ernst, who Veronica mentioned earlier. They married in 1946, and the couple lived in Sedona, Arizona, which is where you see Dorothea Tanning pictured in her studio on the right in this beautiful photo by Lee Miller. So they lived in Sedona, Arizona for many years and then eventually settled in the south of France in 1957. And Dorothea Tanning had a really kind of wide-ranging career. She was largely self-taught. She worked as an illustrator, a painter, a printmaker, a sculptor. She did sets and costume designs for George Balanchine, and she also wrote several books. So she was really kind of a polymath. And even within her kind of visual art output, her styles really range from something more kind of academically painted, like Birthday, to her later more abstract work, which the frieze that we've been gifted belongs to, and we'll be seeing a few more examples of that work too in a moment. Dorothea Tanning received her first Paris exhibition at Gallery Furstenberg in 1954, and she really talked about that as being important for establishing her importance beyond her connection to Max Ernst. For a long time, his career really eclipsed hers. And she actually would not receive a solo exhibition in an American museum until 2000 at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which had just acquired Birthday. And so at that point, she was 90 years old before she received her first solo show at an American institution. After Max Ernst died in 1956, Dorothea Tanning moved back to New York, and she lived there until her death in 2012 at age 101. So Dorothea Tanning, like Leonora Carrington, were kind of these women surrealist artists who lived into their hundreds, and were kind of two of the last surrealists to pass away from the kind of original generation of surrealists. And so it's fantastic that she received that recognition in her lifetime, finally. And then in 2018 and 19, the Reina Sofia in Madrid and Modern presented a major exhibition of Tanning's work. So she's had kind of a renaissance again recently.
Before you move on, Claire, one question about Dorothea Tanning. Do you know which Balanchine ballet she designed for?
Ooh, I do. I have it in my notes. I know there's, oh, they have some really good titles. Let me see if I can find.
I like this. This is turning into a trivia version of Curated Conversations.
No, okay. Night Shadow in 1946. I know was one of them, as well as Bayou in 1952, but she did several between 46 and 53. Amazing. 4 ballets for him.
Amazing.
Yeah. Are there any other questions I can answer before we move on?
So Mark Gross had a question about, and thank you for one of our attendees just said there's a great documentary on Balanchine on YouTube. And since we're all needing good documentaries, thank you, Catherine. Mark Gross asked, when does art enter the collection? And I don't know what is that. Mark, maybe you want to elaborate on your question, or do you mean like what's the process, or maybe you can add a little something there. But we can explain. Claire, do you want to just explain like the process for something coming into the museum? Oh, does the collector die or what, he says. No, we do not count on collectors dying for this.
Yeah. The collector dies or what, or something else happens, or we're offered a gift or some funds with which to purchase something, that will usually come to one of us. On the curatorial staff, we will relay it to our colleagues and ultimately to an acquisitions committee. It gets approved to be presented at the acquisitions committee. And that's where we kind of present our research on the object, talk about why it's important to the collection, where it would fit, what areas, or gaps, as we're kind of discussing here, what gaps it would fill. And then we kind of go through a discussion and ultimately decide whether or not to bring the work in for a final inspection, so we can kind of lay eyes on the physical object. And once it's kind of passed its final condition check, it gets the official thumbs up for addition to the collection.
And so and it has to be unanimous. We all have to come to a consensus that it really needs to be the whole team. And the team is composed of curators in every department, and a couple other senior staff members like the head of education, the director. It's not a group of collectors in our case, and every museum is a little different. There are collection committees that are totally different than ours. And we also have a question about Dorothea Tanning's skirt in Birthday and what is going on with that skirt.
Sure. So if I recall correctly, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of metamorphosis is a big theme in surrealist work generally. And I think here her skirt is sort of turning into sort of this, I guess it's sort of thorny branches. So she's almost kind of becoming part of nature in that way, but a lot of the time her work features kind of an interior environment, like you see her here. She described this as her apartment in New York, which had kind of a series of doors that kind of created for her this fantastic environment. And then you see this sort of little, I don't know what it's even supposed to be, kind of a winged creature at her feet. So again, there's this element of kind of transformation and strangeness that I think really makes this kind of a hallmark surrealist work and really a landmark within Dorothea Tanning's career too.
It seems like Sheltering at Home gone awry.
Right, yeah. I'm turning into a plant too. I guess if we'll go on to the next, slide, please. And I will say that the biographical note that's really crucial for Dorothea Tanning when we're talking about the work of art that we've received at the Blanton is to know that she loved dogs. On the right, you see her with the dog that started it all, Max Ernst, his Lhasa Apso, Kachina, she's holding in this photograph again by Lee Miller. taken in Sedona. And on the left, you see her photo collage that she made about 20 years later, in which she's depicting herself as a dog. She's collaged this dog head on top of her own, and she's holding, I think, one of the Pekingeses that Dorothea Tanning had after Katrina. So she kind of continued to have Pekingese dogs for the rest of her life. And she really kind of identified with these dogs as a sort of personal talisman, and they recur throughout her work. If we could jump to the next slide. I have just a sampling here of dogs in Dorothea Tanning's work from the 50s and 60s. But you can see really kind of the range of styles in which she was working. So on the left, we have the work that's Tableau Vivant from the National Galleries of Scotland, where you can see she's working here kind of in a more figurative style. It's a little, it's a little looser and brushier than something like Birthday would have been, but it's not nearly as abstracted as The Dog and Her Muse in 1964, which you see on the far right, which is really more in keeping with this sort of prismatic abstraction style that she was working in from maybe the mid 50s into the 60s. So you can see a lot of the time there's this real kind of tangle between the person and the dog. They're kind of identified with each other and sort of locked in an embrace that I think becomes really relevant for us. If we go to the next slide, please. We see the Blanton work again, and I think we can kind of start to look at the brown figure. There's kind of a pinkish, fleshier figure, as well as a brown figure that are kind of shown in a series of kind of interlocking limbs and poses, almost as if they're kind of dancing or in an embrace, or maybe battling or wrestling. And I think we can probably start thinking about the work that's, or the figure that's depicted in brown as a dog. So I think this is also a really fascinating moment within Tanning's body of work, because this is really kind of a transitional point in her work. Around the same time that she made this frieze, 1965, she also began a series of soft sculptures representing abstracted bodily forms and figures. And I have a couple of images of those if we want to jump ahead. So these soft sculptures, again, I think have this motif that we'll recognize from the frieze that we just looked at. It's this kind of, kind of a darker figure intertangled with, a more kind of recognizably human form. She was making these sculptures out of fun fur. So often there will be one figure that's made out of fun fur, another one that's made with other kind of fabric scraps, often from a thrift store. She would stuff them with wool, and sometimes they're embellished with like table tennis balls, jigsaw pieces, or pins. But there's this really sort of erotic element to them, as well as something a little bit sinister, which I think is really amplified in kind of the culminating work in Tanning's soft sculptures, which is the work on the right, this room installation that the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris owns, the Poppy Hotel Room 202, from the early 1970s. And I think you can see here the figures, the soft sculpture figures are kind of morphing into furniture. They're kind of out of walls. So they have this sort of sinister, erotic, but very playful element to them that I think also relates back to the frieze. If we could jump ahead one more, please. So this was the first work by Dorothea Tanning to enter our collection, but it complements the works we have by other surrealists who were based in the Americas. So on your left, you see Leonora Carrington, who was working in Mexico City. On the right, you see Arshile Gorky, who was based in New York, as well as Connecticut and Virginia a little bit. So this is an area of our collection that I'm really excited to be growing, and really thrilled to have Tanning represented in our collection at last. So I'll check the Q&A and see if there are any Tanning questions that I can answer before we move on to our next artist.
Did you say fun fur, by the way?
Fun fur, yeah, like like fake fur.
That's like the greatest medium ever.
Yeah. Yeah, so also Carter is asking about the sculpture at the Menil, which is called Cousins. I don't know if I don't know if it's still on view. It was maybe about to come off view. Natalie, okay, thank you. It's still on view, says Natalie. Hi, Natalie.
It's really nice when someone from the Manila is on the Zoom and can answer the question.
Very convenient. But yeah, that's another fantastic example of Dorothea Tanning soft sculptures that you can see here in Texas. And
yeah, anyone who hasn't been to the Manil, I know you can't go right now, but really one of the greatest collections in the whole country. But if you're a surrealism geek like Claire, it is like Mecca.
Martha asks, would Tanning have met or known Carrington? Yes, they traveled in the same circles, but also they had Max Ernst in common, and both were involved with him at different points.
He was like the Kevin Bacon of artists.
Yeah, yeah. So I believe they would have known each other, but probably weren't super tight. I don't know. All right, if there aren't any other questions, I'll move on to our next slide, please. And we're going to jump ahead about 50 years, or maybe more, as we will discuss. And we're going to see here we have two recent drawings by Robert Pruitt. We have Untitled, Channeling Uhura, and Sup. Both of these from the last few years. Sup is from 2018 and Channeling Uhura from 2016. Robert Pruitt works in sculpture and photography, but he's really best known for these large-scale figurative drawings. Each of these are over 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, but he has worked even larger than that. And this scale gives his figures kind of a real power. They're always in a very sort of commanding pose, and these are usually friends or family members that he gets to pose for him. Unfortunately, I don't actually know the precise identities of these two sitters, so if anyone was going to ask that, I'm sorry, I don't know. His portraits are typically in a reduced palette, usually kind of charcoal and pencil, but he'll have pops of color. Here we have red. Sometimes he adds little elements of gold, white highlights, things like that, that kind of make it pop a little bit, but the details are what really define his work. So we'll discuss the specifics of these two particular drawings in a moment, but generally Pruitt combines these kind of visual references. He draws on science fiction, hip hop, comic books, art history, Black political struggles, and incorporates everyday objects. And he uses them to kind of explore the complexities of Black identity and allude to what he calls a diverse and radical Black past, present, and future. So he'll add period costumes, astronomical references, electronics, African masks and statues, elaborate hairstyles, and other kind of props and cultural references to these portraits. And because of that, his work is often described as Afrofuturist, in that he recontextualizes his sitters in time and space through these details that he adds, and in doing so, he creates kind of new ways of imagining Black cultural life. If we jump ahead to the next slide. Great, okay. Pruitt's bio. He was born in Houston in 1975, so he's a native Texan. In 2002, he was a co-founder of Odebega Jones and Associates, which is a Houston-based artist collective that has a real kind of pedagogical mission that took forms including actions, writing, DJ sets, and installations. He earned his MFA at UT in 2003, and actually while he was at UT, he worked at the Blanton as part of our installation crew, which is why we're so thrilled to have his work in the collection, finally. Robert Pruitt has held prestigious residencies, including the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, and the Joan Mitchell Center. And his work was included in the 2006 Whitney Biennial. He's also had solo shows at the California African American Art Museum most recently, as well as the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Fabric Workshop and Museum in Philadelphia, and the Contemporary Art Museum Houston. And he currently lives and works in New York City.
It actually is in the same building as Nate Lewis, by sheer coincidence. Oh. We've got the Bronx in the house tonight. Love in the Bronx.
If we could jump ahead, I'll talk a little more specifically about Channeling Uhura. All right, so here she is. The title, as those of you who are big Star Trek fans might have known already, refers to Lieutenant Nyota Uhura, although I think she was later promoted to a commander, so I should correct that note. She was a translator and a communications officer in the original Star Trek crew, and you see her there on the top right. The character of Uhura was born in the United States of Africa in 2233, and her name, Uhura, is a play on uhuru, which is the Swahili word meaning freedom. Uhura was portrayed by Nichelle Nichols, and she was one of the first kind of high-profile Black characters in an American television series who didn't have kind of a menial role. She was really an integral part of the Star Trek crew. And according to Nichols, she was planning to leave the show after its first season. And when she met Martin Luther King Jr., she mentioned this to him, and he was really upset because he was a big fan of the show. And he said, you know, don't you understand, for the first time we're seen as we should be seen. You don't have a Black role, you have an equal role. And so Uhura's significance as a television character and within kind of the sci-fi universe is pretty significant. So I think that's probably why Robert Pruitt chose to title this work after her, although I will note, as you might see, the figure that he's depicted in channeling Uhura doesn't have Uhura's kind of signature earpiece that you see, that little microphone next to her mouth. She actually has the Spock ears that you see on Mr. Spock down at the bottom. And you can see that they're kind of just tucked on top of her actual ears. She's not really a Vulcan. This is kind of an improvised costume, which I think is something we'll come back to when we're talking about the second work that we've acquired, Sup. But she's standing in profile, so this kind of strong position, and she's wearing a t-shirt emblazoned with a red and black sawtooth quilt pattern that Robert Pruitt seems to incorporate into his work fairly recently, with her braids kind of cascading over her shoulder. So if we want to jump ahead one. Great, so we'll talk a little bit about Sup. I really enjoy the wordplay of this title, both that it's kind of a casual shortening of Superman, as well as kind of a what's up, Sup. So I think that wordplay is intentional. Sup depicts a man in profile. He's standing with his hands clasped, and he has a red piece of fabric tied like a cape around his neck and shoulders, but it's kind of again, an improvised cape. His t-shirt has an S on it, but it's not the kind of hallmark Superman S. It's an S shape popularized as a graffiti sign that's known as the cool S or the super S. And it's sometimes conflated with the diamond-shaped S that's on Superman's costume, which you see on Christopher Reeve on the lower left, as well as in this great self-portrait by Robert Pruitt on the upper left. And Pruitt has talked about Superman as being kind of a problematic figure. He says he's, quote, entrenched in alienation and longing while often reifying ideas of white patriarchal supremacy. So I think this is an attempt, you know, through this kind of improvised Superman costume to represent an alternative envisioning of the Superman myth as a Black figure that allows for self-determination and kind of assuming the mantle of Superman, really kind of empowering anybody to take on this costume and the attendant power. So I think these are a great kind of pair of works, and they were a fantastic fit for our collection. If we want to jump ahead one, please. So they're the first works by Robert Pruitt that we've acquired for the collection, but a fantastic fit, not just because he's really an incredible artist and a UT and Blanton alum, but also represents a continuation of a legacy that is very well represented in our collection through the work of Charles White, who was another kind of consummate draftsman, made incredible drawings like Robert Pruitt, and really committed to portraying Black figures in a really imaginative but dignified way. So I've included on the right a work by Charles White that we don't own this one, but it's one of my absolute favorites, and I thought it was a great comparison with Robert Pruitt, who, when I think of a kind of a hallmark Robert Pruitt work, I always think of kind of these really elaborate hairstyles, and often they'll incorporate objects. Either the hair will become an object, or an object will be incorporated into the hair. And so here you see there's kind of an African sculpture kind of tied into this woman's fabulous hairstyle. If we jump ahead one, please. The Blanton does have 23 works by Charles White, which were a generous gift from Drs. Susan G. and Edmund W. Gordon, making us a major center for Charles White's work. So this is an area of the collection that, you know, we really want to kind of build on that legacy.
Claire, can I interrupt you and just say that we jointly own those with Black Studies at UT. So you were probably going to mention that anyway, but we did the installation shot that she's showing, Black Studies and the Blanton. We collaborated on 2 shows together, which we curated together, which was an amazing project, which I guess was last year, right? Last year? And I'll put in a little plug for our Museum from Home content, which is that you can go to blantonmuseum.org/rotation/Charles White, and I think also blantonmuseum.org/museum from home. And there's a virtual tour of the Charles White show that we had at the Blanton, as well as a link to an artist conversation that we had between Deborah Roberts and Robert Pruitt, discussing Charles White and the legacy of the figure in each of their work. And on the right, you see a Robert Pruitt drawing that takes its title from a work by Charles White that's called Two Brothers I Have Had on Earth, and shows 2 figures taking cover under a jacket. So Robert Pruitt has kind of isolated one of the figures and called it A Brother I Have Had on Earth, and has this man kind of sheltering under a coat. There are 8 questions. I think some of the questions are probably better for the end because they're more about the whole process of acquisitions. But this is amazing, by the way, the Star Trek especially. Incredible. But just thinking about, Claire, like, you were really waiting for the right work and looking into, like, this is a little different than Nate Lewis, who kind of was somebody that we discovered by accident and happenstance and then followed up on. Whereas I think Robert was somebody that we had identified as somebody who, like, we couldn't believe he wasn't already in our collection, and we needed to get him into our collection. So that Claire was on the prowl and looking for.
Great. Well, we are, time is running short, so I'm going to turn things back over to Veronica to talk about Lenka Clayton quickly.
Okay, great. So Lenka Clayton will, let's see, advance the slide. Can you guys, I'm not seeing any yet, so hopefully we'll get that on the screen in just a second. But Lenka Clayton is an artist who I have been passionate about for the last, 5 or 6 years. And how I came, very different story than Nate Lewis. I came upon her work when I was invited to jury a prize, and she was one of the submissions. And so I was a juror of something, and I was so taken with her proposal that I looked on her website and was so taken with every other work she had made at that time that I basically became slightly obsessed, and by amazing happenstance was at Crystal Bridges Art Museum in Arkansas with 2 curator friends, and had been talking about how amazing Lenka was, and she was in a show at Crystal Bridges, and there she was literally in front of her work at Crystal Bridges. And it was a little bit like the 3 curators. We sort of were like 10-year-old girls who were seeing Taylor Swift for the first time. We completely fangirled her. We were like, oh my God, you're Lenka Clayton. And she had a bag of artist books, and I remember that we literally bought every single one and, like, brought them all home. There were these amazing artist books. And if you advance, you'll see an image from the body of work that I want to talk about tonight, which is the Artist Residency in Motherhood, which is really a brilliant project, and I don't use that term lightly. Since 2012, Lenka Clayton created a residency inside of her own home in Pittsburgh, and she actually secured grant funding for it. And it was really inspired by the fact that as a British artist based in Pittsburgh, when she was expecting her first child, so many people said to her, how are you possibly going to, keep your career going? And how can you be a serious artist and a serious, and also a mom? And she found that question kind of offensive, that you had to choose one for the other. And I think it's interesting that her husband at the time, who was also an artist, never got asked that question, and only she was asked that question. And she really thought about, the wanting to be a great parent and also continue making her work, and began to think about that, and decided to create a residency out of her own home. I think in some ways to question the assumptions also of the art world. I think one of the things that is brilliant about this project is that she is pointing out the way that the structures of the art world, the artist residency, which is such a staple of artist careers, it's how you have time to make great work and get away from your normal commitments. But, most artist residencies don't allow parents, and they don't allow children, sorry. So if you're a young, a parent to a young child, you don't really have that opportunity. But Lenka decided kind of to make it for herself. So if we can advance the slide. She actually created business cards and considered her son Otto a collaborator, which I love. And you can advance the slide. And this was the object that was in Crystal Bridges, one of the first objects that she made as part of this residency, where she's thinking about motherhood not as a subject, like making art that comments on motherhood, but as a material, which I thought was really interesting. And if any of you have children, you know that the way that they learn about the world, or if you remember this as a child yourself, like children learn about the world by trying to put things in their mouth. And this is an incredible project where she literally Ziploc baggied 63 objects that her son tried to eat or put into his mouth. He's clearly a very precocious and a curious child. There's some somewhat dangerous objects in here, kind of amazing. And then she beautifully, as only an artist could, arranges this on a pedestal with the vitrine. And Crystal Bridges now owns this work. And there's also an amazing artist book that goes with it, which is the one I mentioned that we bought many copies of. If you want to advance the slide. And the body of work that we've brought into the collection, this is a recent acquisition, is from this series of typewriter drawings out of when she created this residency out of her home. She ended up making 32 different bodies of work. And I will say she extended the residency because she had a second child. So it was a little longer residency than initially expected. And she's always loved typewriters, but she thought about, what kind of art could she make in the fragmented time that she had while her children were napping, for example. And so her first efforts, I'll show you some more images in a moment that are simpler than these, but I really think she became so adept at and skilled at making drawings using a typewriter. And so what she's doing is really just feeding in the paper. You're seeing here a crease in the middle. She's maybe folded the paper in half at first, and she's feeding it in sideways. And so the circular or sort of curve of the vase is being made by parentheses in some cases, lines. I mean, it's incredible to just think about. And you see in the detail, I'm amazed that the letters W's and S's can somehow create this Chinese vase. What's also interesting about this body of work to me, though, is that in her residency, I can't remember if I mentioned this, she actually secured grant funding from a couple local agencies, and that allowed her to have childcare for 2 days out of the week. And that's when she would make this work. If you keep going forward. And then this is a series of, again, of more recent typewriter drawings that we acquired from Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco, who's her gallerist. And these are, so I've been following this work for several years, so was lucky enough to be able to sort of pick out some favorites from a recent show. And this is, you're seeing on the left, she's actually gotten really interested in archives and handwriting. So she's using probably just the period key and replicating, I'm sorry, this is a little pixelated, but she's using, she found a note in the Met's archive in Alfred Stieglitz's handwriting about Georgia O'Keeffe. And so she's doing, she's representing that in the typewriter. And I also love the humor in Animal photographed by an East German spy. Okay, we can keep going. She also occasionally does commissions. So she has done some New York Times covers and front pages that sometimes she'll do those as a commission for someone if you want to mark like an important occasion. And I'm just amazed that that you can see the Cartier watch ad in the lower right. And I love the sort of way she's also incorporated the folds in the paper, Berlin from a distance. That's such a simple drawing, but sometimes she says the simple ones can take her the longest because it's just sort of coming up with a great concept. So you see Berlin from a distance on the right, and then a more complex one, Today's Newspaper, on the left. Keep going. And this is a real personal favorite of mine, Drinking Straw and Water. This was in a show that Lenka and I did together at Test Site in Austin, which is this wonderful art space that is run out of the home of Lawrence Miller and Judy Wilcott. And this was in that show. And they acquired it and generously promised it to the Blanton. And I just love the way, you know, you get the sense of how the straw looks in water and the way she's used the fold of the paper for that kind of jump. And all that you're seeing are parentheses. So really, it's incredible the way she's able to come up with just ordinary, everyday items that she's making into these drawings. Keep going. This is Score for Music Walk by John Cage. And you're seeing on the credit lines for a lot of these promised gifts of folks in the Austin community or in San Francisco who've been kind enough to promise these to us. And what a promise is essentially that someone gets to keep living with the work, but they are promising it to the Blanton ultimately. And it's sort of a nice situation for everyone involved. And that's how we've been able to acquire some really great, kind of acquire her in depth. Okay, we can keep going. So another thing that is really brilliant about the Artist Residency and Motherhood is that so Lenka didn't have a gallery when she started the project in 2012, and she was using and she also lives in Pittsburgh, which is not where everyone is necessary, you know, not perhaps the epicenter of the art world. So what she was doing was she was getting flooded with emails from other mothers and caregivers around the world saying like, oh, I'm, you know, about to be a mom, or I am a mom and I'm struggling with making work and being a parent. I've read about your residency and motherhood. How do I apply? But obviously you can't apply to work in Lenka's home. So Lenka began to realize there was such a need for this and demand that she actually created a website and kind of a really simple downloadable template so that people could create their own residencies in motherhood. And at this point, there are 900 artist moms mostly, but artist caregivers, and in 64 countries. And it's pretty great. I'll get these emails from Lenka saying like, someone from Namibia has joined the residency in motherhood, or, you know, from Alaska or wherever, some new place that she's thrilled that, and she's even been collaborating with some of those artist caregivers, all of whom are strangers and people that she doesn't know. So it's just an incredible project. I realize we're running out of time, so I want to make sure we get to answer some questions. And let's see, should we start with, let's see, we have a question about, from one of the attendees says, seems like the Blanton has really worked to diversify its collections. Are there any particular gaps you are still working to fill? The answer is, we are Swiss cheese. We are working to fill all of them. There's like endless gaps, right? So our collection, we're a relatively young museum. So we have sort of identified key areas that we would like to expand, but the gaps are pretty numerous, right? I think that would be fair to say. And then you also are asking, maybe Claire can answer this, are there any areas or genres you don't pursue? And if so, why not?
Right, I mean, I think when we talk about filling gaps, you know, yes, in the scope of all of art history, you know, we're not an encyclopedic museum. Even encyclopedic museums have gaps too. So what we're really trying to do is kind of identify, I think, gaps within the strengths that we kind of already have, you know, like we're not, you know, I don't think we're trying to build, you know, a collection of like Chinese terracotta warriors or anything, because that's not something that we already have represented in any way. So we're not kind of starting from scratch. So I would say if there's an area or genre we don't pursue, it's kind of something that wouldn't kind of fit and or complement what we already have, if that makes sense. I think, you know, Carter's saying African-American modernists is a big gap. The Michener collection is a really fascinating collection and very strong in women artists, which is something I think is really interesting about that collection, but it's weak in African-American modern artists working in the period in which Michener was collecting. So that's an area that we're looking to grow. I know sculpture is something we've talked a lot about wanting to grow as well, but also kind of either fitting existing collecting areas or complementing our existing areas, if you think about kind of the collecting strategy that we have.
And I would also say, to add on what Claire's saying, you know, our collection, while we would love to have, for example, a Jackson Pollock or a great Dorothea, Dorothea Tanning painting, some of these things have kind of, they're hard for us to acquire. They're beyond our financial grasp. So some of those holes would only be filled if someone gives us a work that they own. And I would say that tends to not be the work that we're focused on. I think we're really focused on artists we believe in who are not yet, you know, market darlings and people who are worth billions of dollars. We're also excited about building an important collection for the future. So, and thinking ahead. Some other questions. Let's see. Oh, good question. What is it like? Bobby Dixon is asking, what is it like behind the scenes as far as storage and preservation of the Blanton collection? That is a great question. Storage is an amazing place. You should visit it sometime, but you'd have to be escorted by one of us. But actually, it's so important to store art well. And so we have designated facilities on site and off site, but it's one of the reasons that caring for a collection is actually quite expensive. So somebody also asked earlier if we ever turn things down, and the answer is yes, we absolutely turn things down. And it's not because we're mean or that we, but really for us to even accept a gift, I know this is gonna sound a little crazy, but for us to even accept a gift of a work of art, we really have to wanna put it up right away, because the cost of caring for a collection is really expensive, because it needs to be, it's not like having it in your closet at home. There's a lot more involved at a museum. It needs to be in climate controlled facility and space. And so actually storage, if any of you have offsite storage, you know this a little bit, it can really be expensive. So we're really thoughtful about what we're bringing into the collection, and we're only saying yes to things that we will actively put on view. We have some good Lenka questions too. So one person asked, besides the commissions, does Lenka ever revisit older typewriter drawings? And I think the answer is yes. Like she really loves rugs, for example. Like she's really obsessed with rugs, and Ani Albers in particular. Like she's always doing amazing typewriter drawings of rugs. You can see certain things that she loves. Oh, and I forgot to share some of the great images of some of the Corona typewriter drawings that she's been making. They're incredible. I think she's one of the most productive artists during this pandemic, and she's made some really incredible drawings of tea towels cut up to make masks and other work. So I think, you know, the ability to make work from her own home was already something that she had, and she's really been able to pursue in this moment. Do you see any questions, Claire, you want to answer?
No, I mean, I think we have to, we're running out of time, and we should maybe wrap it up.
We just want to say thank you, everyone, for being on this call. And we so enjoyed ourselves, and hope you guys enjoyed yourselves too. And a little shout out to all the wonderful artists that we are so thrilled to be bringing into our collection, and all the donors who have helped make that possible, because we're really incredibly grateful. So enjoy the rest of your cocktail at home, and we hope to see you next Tuesday. And Claire will share what next Tuesday's program is.
Yes, so we have a few little reminders before you leave, and thank you all for joining us. Our next curated conversation will be next Tuesday, April 28th at 5, and it's called Subverted, Sealed, Delivered, Nail Art in Latin America, which is a fantastic title. It will feature a live Q&A with our curators of Latin American art. And if you want to see videos of our past curated conversations, browse our permanent collection online, take virtual tours, and enjoy more ways to museum from home with the Blanton, you can go to blantonmuseum.org/museumfromhome. And so you see that on your screen. If you're not a member, please consider joining for special perks and to support the museum at blantonmuseum.org/membership. Or if you'd just like to subscribe to our email newsletter for info about upcoming programs and other news, you can sign up for that at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe. And finally, if you have any other topics that you'd love to see us cover in a future curated conversation, you can drop us a line at media@blantonmuseum.org. So thank you again, and we'll see you all this time next week.
Bye.
Bye.